Delighted to have you join us this afternoon for a look behind the data to learn how 2020 changed the way Americans view higher education. The COVID-19 pandemic dramatically upended our world and our nation's higher education system. And while attitudes towards America's colleges and universities were already evolving, the pandemic flipped our nation's higher education system on its head and is likely to have long-lasting impacts on current students, prospective students, and the entire higher education community for years to come. Luckily, several organizations, including our team at Third Way, have conducted public opinion research throughout the pandemic, tracking students and voters' perceptions of higher ed and learning what the shifting attitudes mean for the sector's long-term sustainability. To help us unpack the findings from diverse stakeholder groups, we're joined today by Tamara Hiler, Director of Education at Third Way, Rachel Fishman, Deputy Director for Research at New America, Sarah Sattelmeyer, Project Director at Pew Charitable Trusts, and Katherine Wheatle, Strategy Officer for Federal Policy and Equity at the Lumina Foundation. Each of our presenters will spend a few minutes sharing highlights from their research, followed by a panelist discussion and a moderated audience Q&A. We want to be sure you get value out of this conversation, so please take advantage of the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and submit your questions to our experts. Finally, please note this conversation is on the record and it is being recorded. So if there are things you missed or will want to reference again, you will be able to do so at a link that will be posted on Third Way's website. And with that, I'd like to kick things over to Tamara Hiler to get us started.
Hi, thanks, Nicole, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Oops, sorry about that. Really excited about today's discussion. So I'm going to kick things off. As many of you know, over the last 3 to 4 years, really, Third Way has spent a lot of time studying voter perceptions of higher education, and in particular, asking questions surrounding voters' views on the value of higher ed, and also trying to get a better sense of what it is they want from Congress and the administration when it comes to making sure that students and taxpayers are actually seeing some sort of return on investment. So to see some potential shifts in these attitudes, the research that I am quickly going to highlight in my presentation today is a survey that we conducted late last year with a global strategy group at the very end of 2020, so nearly 9 months into the pandemic at that point, of 1,000 nationwide likely voters, and we also oversampled Hispanic voters, Black voters, and also institutional leaders. So next slide. I think the first major takeaway that I really want to emphasize here, that in a lot of ways has been lost in conversation over the last year, is really around the toll that, despite the toll that the pandemic has actually taken on a lot of Americans, on the higher education system and students in particular, what we continue to see is that voters still overwhelmingly see some value in higher education, right? So what we see is that even though there has been a slight dip, and for very valid reasons that we'll get into throughout this presentation and conversation today, we still see that, you know, voters across the board, 2/3 of voters across the board, as well as, you know, nearly, not surprisingly, 9 in 10 institutional leaders in particular, are still saying that, you know, the return on investment of a degree after high school is still excellent or good. Next slide. That being said, there are still very real concerns around how much college costs and how a shift to online learning has potentially diminished the quality of a degree that students have received, which I know Rachel will get into a lot more in her presentation just in a moment, which is why we see that even though voters still believe that, you know, higher education matters and that people should seek, you know, earning some sort of post-secondary education. What we also see, though, is that improving the value of higher education or of a degree is now a more important priority across the board than it was before the pandemic. We see this more acutely with Hispanic and Black voters. Nearly half of them say that It is either somewhat more important or much more important that we improve the value of a degree. But we also see that nearly 2/3 of institutional leaders are saying this, in large part because they probably realize that things have reached a fever pitch, and that failure to address some of the larger systemic questions around affordability, for example, could have a long-term impact on the sector, especially in light of additional state budget cuts or the additional financial concerns that we're likely to see in a post-COVID economy. Next slide. So in fact, what we do see is that when we look really carefully at sort of what voters find important, a lot of the conversation around wanting to see greater value in higher ed is in fact driven by fears of an economic downturn. So for example, we see that the number one thing voters find important to them personally across the board is making sure that students can receive a degree that allows them to pay back their loans. We also see a theme here that voters think it's particularly important that degrees actually lead to socioeconomic mobility, that there is some sort of financial and academic support that's provided to students, especially those who are working during this pandemic, and that students who start college actually finish. The last point I want to point out before I turn it over to Rachel is that what did fall to the very bottom of this list is that some of the more popular policy ideas that we're hearing a lot about these days, especially on the left, about proposals to make college free, either tuition free or debt free, is that we've seen that, even before COVID, voters on both sides of the aisle were fairly consistent in saying that, we're okay paying something to go to college. It's not necessarily that they're looking for some sort of free handout. But what is very, very evident in this research and what we've seen throughout this pandemic is that there is a much more vocal demand these days for making sure that what they are paying is actually going to lead to something of value in return, that they're going to get the skills that they need to get jobs that can help them weather the potential economic storm that's to come. But these are things that have kind of bubbled under the surface for a while that are cracked wide open. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel now, who's going to dig further into some of these findings, particularly what we've heard from students over the last year.
Thanks, Tamara. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Fishman, and I'm Deputy Director for Research at New America. And today I'm going to focus on two surveys that gauge the decision-making of current and prospective college students. So you'll probably see the links to these surveys in the chat box. But if you, there's lots of data to unpack, and I only have 5 minutes to unpack it. So these are some very top-level findings, but there's lots of great data there. And I encourage you to click on those links as they come out and take a look at your leisure and have your data fill. So the first surveys are undergraduate tracking poll that we conducted in partnership with Third Way. December was our most recent iteration. We also had a run of it in August. In December, we surveyed 1,008 college students, including oversamples of Black, Latinx, and caregiving students. And we also had a subsample of high school seniors that had expressed at least some interest in attending college. And so here's what we learned about how student sentiments have changed, about the challenges they've faced as learning has moved predominantly online since the pandemic began last spring. So 60% of students are finding it hard to stay motivated to learn. That's an increase in since August, where it was 50%. And if you look for Black students, the increase is quite large. It's gone from 42 to 59%. Taking care of children, so that's the third data point down, is also an increasing challenge for our caregiving students. And having enough resources to pay for school has also remained difficult for students. So if you want to go to the next slide, here are some of the actions that could make students re-enroll. So it's no surprise that a lot of these answers had to do with our changed economy economy and the fact that we're in a pretty deep economic recession. So this includes offering discounted tuition if students can't attend class in person, demonstrating positive employment outcomes for students through their job placement rates or what their average wages are, and offering new programs and certificates that are tailored to this new emerging economy that we're entering in. On the next slide, I'm going to shift gears and talk about a survey that New America conducted with Lake Research Partners in December. This survey was of current, former, and prospective community college students and was really an effort to try and understand why this 10% enrollment decline occurred at public two-year colleges. There are lots of hypotheses out there as to why it happened, and this unpacks some of that data. We actually asked these students what happened in their lives. So this was almost like a 4-in-1 survey where we had 4 distinct groups of respondents and over 1,600 respondents. So we had continuers, who were students that were enrolled in the spring of last year and maintained enrollment in the fall, stopouts who were enrolled in the spring but decided not to enroll in the fall, new students who were thinking about enrolling in the spring and did enroll in the fall, and then aspirant students who were thinking about enrolling in the spring and then did not enroll in the fall. And what our primary finding here is that COVID-19 poses a serious health and economic threat that distracts these students and would-be students from their academics. So across the board, we saw a lot of challenges these students and would-be students were facing. 35 to 49% across all groups had fallen behind on a bill, applied for public benefits, or needed help with food. Not pictured, but deeply important, is that 16 to 28% across the board were housing insecure, were facing eviction or foreclosure. And this was particularly the case for our stop out students. On the next slide, you'll see that the major reasons for stopping enrollment, particularly for stop outs, had to do with finances. So 41% said that they had to work. Not pictured here is that we asked people who were currently employed whether or not they were an essential employee, and there were very high rates across all of our groups of essential employment. And so our hypothesis here is that perhaps these students or these stopouts had no choice to work, and their jobs got a lot more inflexible when it came to schedules because they were working in essential jobs. For aspirant students, the overall top reason was uncertainty, uncertainty due to the pandemic, but followed close behind was a lot of financial considerations, just like our stopout students. On the next slide, you'll see that I think interestingly, something that caught us by surprise is that degree aspiration may be playing some sort of role in who maintains enrollment. So as you can see, the continuers and the new students were more likely to be interested in getting a bachelor's degree or higher, whereas the stopouts and the aspirants were more interested in an associate degree or less. For the aspirants in particular, you see higher rates of interest in high school equivalency or less. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Sarah from Pew to talk about the results of her research.
Thanks, Rachel. So over the last couple years, so both before and during the pandemic, my team at Pew has really been digging into borrowers' perceptions and their opinions about student loan repayment. Existing research has really provided insight into the characteristics of borrowers who have the most difficulty repaying their loans, but far less is known about why they struggle and their personal experiences with the repayment process. And so, this knowledge gap really can make it difficult to assess what reforms are needed to better support borrowers. So to begin to address this knowledge gap, we did some recent polling and conducted a few focus groups, and I'm going to walk you through our high-level takeaways. So this first finding on the slide here comes from a series of focus groups we did across the country with student loan borrowers. We conducted them before the pandemic, so I will be referring to this as, quote unquote, during the best of times, which we know, just it's a shorthand, which provide a helpful counterpoint to surveys we've done during the pandemic, which I'll talk about in a minute. So even in the best of times, borrowers find the repayment system difficult to navigate, especially in two places. They told us that income-driven plans were difficult to get into and stay enrolled in because of the confusing application and recertification processes. And although the 2019 Future Act has the potential to help streamline this process, it's still in the early stages of implementation and a host of other challenges remain. And then having a growing balance from interest accrual and capitalization created psychological and financial barriers to repayment for many borrowers. At the same time, Americans are anxious about their finances. And while the pandemic has exacerbated this for many households, it's not a new phenomenon. Before COVID, many Americans lacked financial security. So we heard from borrowers that their payment challenges were the results of budgets that were already stretched to the breaking point, again, even before the pandemic. Borrowers reported wanting, but being unable to make payments because of their financial difficulties, including unexpected expenses and volatile incomes. And these borrowers really said that they had limited resources and needed to cover costs for transportation, housing, childcare, and things like groceries before paying their loans. And because of these first 2 points, borrowers often struggle to access longer-term solutions. They report that pausing payments by using deferments and forbearances was easy and helpful in times of financial stress, and many chose this option over a more complicated solution such as enrolling in an income-driven plan, especially when they needed immediate relief. So on the next slide, currently payments, interest, and collections are paused for most federal student loan borrowers through the end of September of this year. We conducted a survey last fall to assess borrowers' experiences in and their perceptions of repayment during the pandemic, and we're planning a follow-up survey this spring. Our survey showed that borrowers are aware of the pandemic assistance, likely due to media coverage, outreach from the Department of Education and their servicers, and the fact that borrowers have not had a bill due since March of 2020. But many are confused about whether and how these protections and provisions apply to them. Almost 6 in 10 borrowers with paused payments said it would be somewhat or very difficult to afford their payments if they had to begin making them in the next month. And simultaneously navigating uncertainty, financial challenges, next slide, and a confusing repayment system could lead borrowers to reach out to their loan servicers in unprecedented numbers when payments resume overwhelming the system. So to put a slightly finer point on it, having tens of millions of borrowers restarting repayment at the same time really is unprecedented. And our research shows that as many as 9 million people could be reaching out to their servicers and the Department of Education at the same time for assistance. This could make it really difficult to ensure those who need help are able to access it in a timely manner. Finally, as you see on the slide, Americans overwhelmingly back federal help for borrowers during the pandemic and this period of economic uncertainty. 81% of Americans agree that the government should make it easier for borrowers to repay their student loans, including a majority from both political parties. And these findings highlight the importance of identifying where borrowers are likely to struggle and providing targeted assistance before the period of paused payments ends. So I think we'll talk more about solutions later in the conversation, but at a high level, our team is really thinking about the fact that Congress and the Department of Education should take steps to make transitioning back into repayment easier for borrowers and servicers, including continuing and expanding targeted outreach and measuring the outcomes, providing a grace period for folks who struggle right after the repayment period begins, and making it easier for borrowers to access an income-driven plan. So I will hand things over to Katherine now.
Thanks for having me, and I'm really excited to give a preview of some of our work that will be officially published next week. But first, let me say that Lumina Foundation has undergone its own evolution, which has led us to our latest equity commitment and adoption of our Equity First framework for our work that will touch every aspect of our strategizing, giving, investing, and thought leadership. From our perspective, we hone in on racial equity and believe that equity is achieved when outcomes can no longer be predicted by race, and justice is achieved when underlying policies, practices, and root causes of inequitable outcomes are ultimately eliminated. We double down because inequities and outcomes by race persist and have continued widen even before the public health crisis. In our policy work, this means investing in policy research, advocacy, messaging research, and other ways that will educate policymakers and influencers and the general public about who today's students are, so that policy proposals and debates are more situated to those who use financial aid, and to help us better understand how policymakers and influencers, as well as the general public, understands higher education. Next slide. So in 2019, we worked with Hathaway Communications, and I welcome folks to visit our newly vamped equity page that has a lot of these resources. Again, in 2019, Hathaway Communications conducted a national survey and also engaged with some of our partners on their struggles and challenges of communicating racial equity in their work. We know that folks are in different places and that everyone needs different resources and content expertise and all that. And so we want to be supportive in how do we communicate racial equity in higher education overall, and how can we support our partners and potential partners as well. That survey and those engagements largely happened in 2019 prior to the public health crisis, but they were released last year. And what that does give us is a baseline before the public health crisis, before the racial protests that happened in last summer, giving us a baseline of where the general public was, so that when we move forward with future messaging research, we can compare all the things that have happened since then. Next slide, please. And just to give some high points, talking points here, we know that Americans generally understand that opportunity is unequal or inequitable. Next slide. But when we use the term equity, what does that bring to the ideas or to the remembrance of folks? And a lot of people think of unrelated definitions. I'm hoping that as we move forward in having more messaging research, that will change over time, because at the point that we collected this data, I think racial equity and white supremacy and those types of phrases and concepts are more widely used in the general lexicon. And so I wonder if that will be some changes over time. Next slide, please. So before I jump into what's in the Borrowers of Color work, I wanted to give a little bit of context. This strand of work was conceived in our last strategic plan to bring a more nuanced conversation about race in the student debt conversation, especially as it increasingly impacts enrollment, re-enrollment, and completion. And just to share a little personal anecdote, I am a Black millennial woman, and so coming at who has a PhD. And so if you know anything about the data, you can guesstimate what that level of student loan debt is. When I first got to DC and started to engage in policy conversations, I honestly felt a lot of anxiety and stress, because the conversations felt were filled with offensive assumptions, language, and left on individual level deficit frame solutions and narratives. We understand that student debt is a complex, multifaceted challenge that is compounded by systemic racism. And we contend that we focus on challenging systems rather than blaming individual borrowers. We also know from further messaging research that student debt is among the top 3 most written about policy issues in the United States. So it's a really crowded lane. And it's not being driven by people of color who are most impacted by loan debt. And so the purpose of the Borrowers of Color Working Group, and thank you to Dr. Dominique Baker, who seeded that idea in working with us. We brought together 11 diverse researchers, scholars, and advocates over a year. We took the opportunity to put Black, Latina, and Native experts, leaders, and advocates at the center of the discussion, and leveraging their research, practice-based experiences to explore potentially racist narratives and assumptions about students of color that ultimately permeates how we think about borrowing and borrowers of color. And we also took some time to explore the data limitations that are real and exist, and how we can encourage data disaggregation and improving data systems. We also took resources to support research projects, specifically focused on distinct communities of color. So a few things that are already have been published: NAACP's Youth and College Division produced a Black college student debt report. We've worked with the Education Trust in the past with some of their Black and Brown student debt work. We have partnered with Dr. Kate Ellengold and the great team at UDOS US to explore borrowing among Latinx students. And so there's a white paper available. We are looking forward to see what is produced from the American Indian College Fund. So get to know David Saunders, as well as United Negro College Fund through their research into the Patterson Research Institute, as well as some more detailed research about pathways with the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at Brandeis. I'm particularly interested in hearing and seeing more about how we write about Black women, because Black women in the data shoulder the heaviest debt burdens because they face the added burden of gender discrimination in the workforce when it's time to repay back loans. And if you think again of the compounded nature of where Black women are situated within the workforce, and knowing that the huge impact of the public health crisis on the economy, women have been hit hard, women of color have been hit harder. Black women spend more of their income on repayment than any gender, race or gender subgroup. So there's quite a bit that we can begin to unpack by centering people of color. Next slide, please. And just as a preview again, grateful and thank you to the entire work group for their contributions. Dr. Fenaba Addo and Dr. Dominique Baker correct common myths about Black borrowers and lays out the set of choices Black families make in deciding to take on student loan debt. And so some of those common misperceptions that we hear about Black student loan borrowers is that these racial disparities reflect the differences in the need for financial literacy or more financial education, that Black borrowers inherently are making poor choices, that Black borrowers are the new welfare queen and borrowing too much and using funds frivolously, and we have to confront and problematize some of those narratives. Doctors Denisa Gandara and Desiree Zekera again emphasize the multi-dimensionality of Latinx students and challenge the overly simplistic debt aversion narrative by focusing on variables that better explain Latinx student behavior, thinking about weakened social trust, enrollment decisions, and family level financial decision making. Doctors Christine Nelson, Amanda Tasheen, and J.D. Lopez seek to correct damaging narratives that mask Native student struggles with affordability, including the idea that Native students go to college for free. Their piece draws connections between the United States' long and violent history with tribal nations and the federal government's failure to honor treaties, adequately supporting tribal colleges, and honoring its responsibility in data sovereignty or providing data back to tribal councils. We're grateful to Sarah in her contribution, and she contributes a piece that looks at the need to consider family budget sheets as a way to capture a fuller picture of student borrowing and repayment behaviors amongst borrowers of color. And thank you to Joanna Darkis for her contribution in problematizing debt differences within the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, and points to others who are working to improve AAPI data. We hope that this will be used among all of you joining us today and others who are writing about student debt or getting to better understand how affordability has been a huge racial equity issue in higher education, and largely utilizing our space as a contextualizer as conversations about affordability and particularly debt continue. And with that, I'll pass that over to Tamara.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really jazzed about when this research comes out. And before we start the discussion, I know there's a quick question directly about that in terms of when will these resources become available on the Lumina website?
Sure. So the Talking Equity resources are available right now. You can go to luminafoundation.org under Our Work and taking a look at Talking About Race. The Borrowers of Color report will be released next week on or around the 24th.
Perfect. So great. Well, thank you to everybody. Obviously, that was a lot of information to unpack. I know that we were all just sort of showing the tip of the iceberg of all the different research that we've done. So want to dedicate the next 15 minutes before we turn it over to audience Q&A to just sort of have a discussion amongst ourselves. This is not a formal moderated panel, more of us like being on a podcast or something to just try to unpack some of what we've heard here. So I will just kick things off with the first question that anyone's welcome to sort of jump in first. But just kind of curious, what did you find or have you found to be the most surprising from the research you've done or that you've heard from others this past year? And sort of alternatively, what has been not surprising at all? Rachel, you look like you have something to say. I'll kick you off.
Okay, I'll take it on. So I'd say, like least surprising when we did our community college enrollment work is that a lot of the drop-offs in enrollment had to do with financial concerns. I think what was really interesting is that everybody was facing pretty difficult financial circumstances across the board. So why is it that continuers who are facing difficult financial circumstances, similar to stop outs, maintained enrollment and did not? We did get like a final report from Lake Research that I've been digging into that did a multi-factor analysis. And really there were some interesting results about men in particular, especially young men. I think what has surprised the field when we saw the enrollment decline at community colleges, we were like, well, of course, it's like working mothers who are also doing K-12 distance education at home and like trying to balance a million things. And like, of course, education is going to come last. But I think what was actually surprising is a lot of the enrollment decline was men and young men. And so I'll be unpacking that a little bit in the future, but I think a lot of it has to do with the idea of like they had to work, they had to put food on the table, they were working essential employment. So I look forward to like just digging in and posting about that in the future.
I think something that was surprising to me about our student loan work is that a lot of the times in the field, people talk about sort of the model student loan borrower, right? Someone who sets their auto debit payments and forgets it and has a stable job and sort of goes off into the sunset and pays their student loans. But what our sort of quantitative and qualitative work has shown is that that's a very, very small percentage of people. We did some work before the pandemic that showed that more than 70% of borrowers missed a payment, paused a payment, needed to reach out for assistance, sort of all of the things we associate with maybe borrowers who are having problems. And so these aren't necessarily all bad, right? As long as someone catches up or if they need to pause payments temporarily to deal with a financial setback. But what is striking and what is really important is that as we're thinking about reforms, making sure that the tools that are designed to sort of help people when they face these situations are easy to use to ensure that people can access some of these longer term solutions. So just, almost everyone at some point sort of bumps against the walls of the student loan repayment system.
Yeah, I'll weigh in actually from the perspective of the Hathaway communications stuff, because I've been in touch internally, with our comms team on how it was unfolding. I think the thing that folks should know is that, especially at this point, that most Americans understand that opportunity isn't fair. that most American, while we can bump up against how much college, is it affordable, those are different narratives, but the idea that the ramps aren't the same, people understand. I try to push the second piece of when folks think about equity, are they thinking about a related or unrelated definition? I think, frankly, that can cue, are we talking to a general white middle class audience by forsaking everyone else? And I say, you know, my family is from the Caribbean. I'm a first gen student. I'm all tick off all these things. If I can't explain this to my parents, then there's something to consider about how we're talking about these issues. Who do we think needs to be a part of the conversation? Who gets to weigh in or debate, and whose expertise really matters? And so I say there's a space for all of us to unpack and to really look at how we're writing about students of color. This is a affordability example, but looking at all of our work.
That's such a great point, Catherine. I'd love to ask you and the rest of the group here, what some of the findings from your research or points you highlighted in your presentation mean for policymaking over the next year, whether that's specific policies that policymakers should focus on, or whether it's sort of more general principles and priorities.
Yeah, I'm pretty curious and paying attention to how the new administration is tackling racial equity audits throughout the agencies. And the reason why I'm doing that is not necessarily the direct connections to the work, but more of how does this huge entity take stock of where there needs to be improvements or concerns and addresses when it comes to racial equity. We have, I think there are plenty of institutions of higher education on campus that are trying to take stock of their climate and the ins and outs. And, racism and white supremacy is insidious, and it changes and transforms. So I kind of, ask me your question one more time and make sure there was one other point that I forgot that will come back.
No, I think you hit on so many of the points. Just what should policymakers be focused on?
Okay. Yes, I wanted to make sure that towards the end of our report, myself and my colleague Wayne Talafero kind of put out 5 considerations for how to think about borrowers of color. There's the debate on and considering how does one consider race in policy making without violating any laws or quotas and things like that? How do we not trigger zero-sum thinking amongst our members, constituents, audiences? That we can look at racial equity as all of our responsibility, because it is, not just on a moral sense, but racism is expensive, y'all. There was an article last year that racism costs $1.7 trillion, and I would say probably more than that. And one of the things we talk about is how higher education policy has been violent to communities and how it can be restorative or reparative. I think it's really important to continue to have experts of color and advocates of color at the table and consider their perspectives seriously, because quite frankly, I'm tired of being microaggressed at other people's panels.
Yeah, I can jump in on top of that as well. I mean, thinking about it from sort of the voter research that we've done too, I think number one, like we just need to, even though we live and breathe and think about higher education all day long, like we also have to realize that higher education is still not going to be like the top priority of voters in the year ahead. We know that COVID relief and sort of immediately stemming the effects of the sort of economic fallout are going to remain top billing. But given that, all that being said, sort of going back to some of the research that we found, I think that it is very, very clear that students, families, voters in general are just much more aware of the higher ed issues that we've been talking about today than they probably were a year ago. And they're much more vocal about it. So maybe there were a lot of these questions about, well, is what I'm paying fair? Like, what am I actually paying for when I'm paying a tuition bill? Especially now that, you know, a lot of students are online, like what are they actually getting in return? These are questions that families have been having around the kitchen table for a long time that have now kind of bubbled up to the surface in a very, I think, helpful way that we're not going to be able to put back and pretend doesn't exist. So I think in terms of some of the policy implications in particular, getting back to number one, just a lot around better transparency and data and unlocking this data, and you know, making sure that students have clarity about what are they paying for and what are they actually getting in return. And we know that there's legislation that a lot of our organizations support, like the College Transparency Act, for example, that is like a very baseline thing, has a lot of bipartisan support that could unlock some of this important outcomes data that we care about. But I also think there's going to be real questions around measuring return on investment and how we do that, and especially in light of, Sarah, some of the research that you've been talking around the fact that we've now had almost an entire year where we've paused. You know, students, for the most part, borrowers in most part, haven't been paying their loans. Like, we know there's going to be a huge influx, you know, in a few months when that has to, you know, when the payment pause is potentially lifted. And what is that even going to mean, not only for the students and borrowers and servicers involved in that, but also for, you know, policymakers and advocates that want to be able to measure ROI and have been relying on data points like repayment rates or default rates, or things that we've been sort of traditionally using to better understand the value that an institution is providing. That data is we're gonna have a big gap in that data for a long time. And what are the long-term implications of that gonna be? Just one more thing I wanna mention, and this is also what I found kind of surprising, kind of going back to this idea of online students as well. I think that, like, when we think about 2021 and beyond, like, online education is not going away. And Rachel and I saw that in the joint survey that we did with students as well, that, you know, even though there's a lot of sort of groaning and moaning about having to take classes online, and there are real things that we need to address there, we also saw that a lot of students were like, yeah, I still want my institution to offer hybrid or online courses next year. And so thinking about how do we make that transition for institutions, how do we set up policies that will allow us to better know who's online and what quality learning in the online space looks like, those are things that I think policymakers also need to be considering.
Yeah, and I just want to weigh in and say, like, sometimes I really feel the need to take off my higher ed policy hat. Like, we're so focused on like sort of making college more affordable, helping borrowers, and that's all, I mean, worthy goals. And I mean, that's like what we dedicate our lives to, working in the higher ed policy space. How can we help make college more affordable? How can we help borrowers who are in distress? But the research has shown that like a bigger factor for students and for Americans is this fraying of the Social Security safety net. And it really didn't exist very well before. And now I think the pandemic is just completely ripping it apart. And students are really food insecure, they're home insecure, and it's just you know, you can double the Pell Grant, which is something that many of us have called for, but that's only going to go so far to really helping these students. I mean, we need to make the expansion of SNAP benefits to students permanent. We need to think about work requirements for TANF, and how you can't it's difficult for you to go to school and get access to TANF at the same time because of work requirements. There's just a whole host of problems and issues outside of the higher ed scope that really need to holistically address students' needs, along with all the things that we're really trying to tackle within the higher ed space. It's a really tall order, but this crisis makes it more apparent that this is really the only way that I think we're going to be able to achieve equity moving forward, is to really address the whole system, even beyond the scope of higher education.
So I guess just to that point then, knowing that we have a few more seconds till we'll turn it over to audience Q&A, I just want to also touch on, is there anything that you have found then to be the most meaningful or impactful piece of this work that you've taken away that you want to make sure anyone listening to this conversation also walks away knowing and feeling when they go back to the day-to-day work that they're doing?
I would love to just sort of piggyback on something that both Katherine and Rachel talked about, which is the idea that Americans live one financial life, and that financial life looks different among different groups, but that the idea that when folks are sitting down at the kitchen table to manage their finances, student loans and the cost of college are an important part of the discussion, but so is rent, food, childcare, transportation. And it's really only sort of looking at policymaking from a holistic financial security or insecurity lens that we can sort of drive this conversation forward.
Yeah, I'll jump in as we're gearing up for the Bars of Color report rollout. My colleague Terry Taylor says it so beautifully in the report that we hope these voices and perspectives can help establish a narrative centered on the dignity of people of color, of students of color, one that meets our responsibility to understand these student communities and design solutions that best meet their needs. We're just taking our place in space as thought leaders to provide some necessary context as all policy areas are contending with how they write about Black, Latinx, Native, and Asian American Pacific Islander people.
All right, we are getting lots of questions submitted from the audience, so we're going to move to Q&A with the time we have remaining. Sarah, Katherine, Tamara, Rachel, thank you so much for all the insights that you shared with us. First question, and I think this can be for anyone. Do you have any particular insights related to adult learners and the challenges they are facing during this time, especially as it relates to reskilling via certificate programs?
So I actually do have some relevant data to this, and it's not published, but we did conduct some research using focus groups specifically on short-term credentials. In this case, it was people who were, so our focus group is concentrated on short-term medical certificates, like home care jobs, licensed practicing nurses, and child development associate degrees. And the pandemic has really, we were very shocked to see how much the pandemic has influenced particularly the medical degrees. It pretty much stopped them. Like all the people we talked in the focus groups nationwide, it was really hard for them to continue in these programs because of the hands-on nature and because they were really short-term too. So it's like your only opportunity was this really short-term credential, of which like most of the learning, the preferred learning method was like hands-on, right? Because you're learning all these things. And so a lot of them just decided to forgo the opportunity. They were like maybe a couple weeks into their program when the pandemic hit. They tried it online, and universally, again, like focus groups are not representative, but it was really interesting that for these focus groups, they were basically like, you know, it's too difficult. I'm going to have to wait until the pandemic ends until we can do this stuff in person, because I don't feel comfortable learning about how to take care of people and doing all these procedures and not being able to help people and understand what that looks like. So again, not nationally represented data, but a little bit of insight into some of these programs and reskilling that was going on.
I just want to say not yet, but stay tuned, and I will check in with comms, because adult learners are of two of our center priority populations, and learning more about how institutions can engage, outreach, all those things are part of ongoing work that we're going to be digging into.
All right, thanks guys. Next question here. Do you have any thoughts on purely online universities and on-campus universities offering online courses and how they should be treated?
I mean, I can sort of jump in. I think that it's an interesting question. And in fact, we did a set of focus groups at the very start of the pandemic, so around May or June, and actually we had samples of students who had been in exclusively online institutions before the pandemic started, and then also, of course, the set of students who like got thrown into an online education last March and, you know, had to experience that for the first time. You know, what I think that was you know, not totally surprising is that a lot of the students who had already been in online institutions didn't feel, you know, any sort of major shockwaves from that transition or the system, and, you know, said that their institution obviously had more preparation for this kind of online learning module versus a lot of students who attended institutions in person felt like, you know, there was a very, very steep learning curve, especially at the end of that spring semester when professors were being thrown into online programs for the very, very first time. That being said, you know, I think that overall, the tricky part, and as I mentioned before, is that we just don't have a lot of good data about what does quality learning online look like. Like, that's a very hard question to answer. And, you know, student experience and them feeling like, you know, their institution has some understanding about how to deliver that, you know, in a way that's not just pre-taped lectures, sort of these asynchronous sessions all the time where they feel completely disengaged from their learning. That's going to be really important. And so, you know, I think that when it comes to especially oversight or accountability as we look ahead for policymakers, I don't necessarily think that we need to create two different systems for how we're providing oversight. I think we need to actually figure out and create one good system and start to try to answer that question at its core of what is quality learning, how are we measuring it, and how can we apply that sort of across the board. I don't know if others have thoughts as well.
Thanks, Tammy. The next question is around messaging. So based on the messaging findings, what do you wish people would stop saying and what should we start saying?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. First, I'll just say that I hope that people just, or writers, communicators would just pause a second once you get to your almost there draft, taking a look through about what are the assumptions that are being made throughout the piece about how people are responding to decisions that they're making. I think about how inelastic higher ed prices have been over the last year or over the last few decades, and wondering where is that point of break, and that we're probably seeing that as a result of the public health crisis, that you can't have soaring costs and expanding what students are responsible for without seeing a break in participation. I would hope that we do more contextualizing, engaging with student advocate voices in this space, using multiple forms of media to tell the story of folks, considering the dual, multiple natures of systems of oppression, and really giving a solid treatment of intersectionality and how it impacts women of color and Black women in debt. I think the one thing that I want to emphasize with our report is that we're not weighing in on a specific policy proposal, but more of taking stock as we move forward, that this is one of the largest issues in America amongst so many other things. How can we use some of these lessons in all of our work? And also, one thing I didn't share that I was shocked by how many people were either intentionally or unintentionally utilizing the narrative that Native students go to college for free. Like, you know, these racist narratives, you know, the welfare queen, and knowing these things that they were constructed for political reasons, but they still permeate our subconscious, they still permeate our assumptions. So those are the things.
One thing I'll add too is that we spend a lot of time talking about the problems with student loans and the problems with the student loan repayment system. And that's, you know, what I spend 8 hours a day, every day doing. And so I think is a worthy pursuit. But making sure that the idea that, you know, student loans are beneficial to some in the current system we have, we may want to work toward making that system look different in the future. But we heard from students and from borrowers in our focus group across the country that they were getting this message that maybe they shouldn't be going to college if it meant having to take out a student loan. And so I think it's important to tell a more nuanced story, to talk about completion, to talk about sort of some of the tools that are available to help people, while also talking about some of the problems in the system.
Thanks. So we have just 3 minutes left, and I have a question here that I really want to make sure we get asked. I am going to challenge you all to answer it in as few words as possible. So just like a couple sentences. What is the most pressing research that we still need or that's missing in the field of higher education?
So I'm happy to kick it off. The idea of fixing income-driven repayment plans or otherwise making them more accessible is something we talk about a lot, but we actually know very little information about these plans. And so sort of we need this, like, a much more robust data set and more information on how borrowers use them, what types of structural change would help those most struggling with delinquency and default, and how to manage growing balances.
Totally agree. We need that for sure. I know that that's going to be a big policy conversation in the next year for sure. I would just say, I think we're going to need more research about exactly what from this pandemic is going to be sort of permanent changes to the system and the way students approach going to college versus what is temporary. I know it's very easy for us to make comparisons to the Great Recession. That's the last time we sort of have an indication of, okay, typically in a recession, enrollment at post-secondary education institutions spike, but this is a very different kind of recession and situation that we've been in the last year. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see what actually permanently changes from, for example, students not having to make payments for almost a year now. What is that going to mean? The other thing that I know Rachel and I have talked a lot about too is just continuing to keep an eye on prospective college students, and particularly those who, you know, juniors and seniors who have kind of had very strange experiences their last 2 years of high school, and how that's going to impact, you know, the choices that they make for enrolling or not enrolling. And I'd also just be really curious for us to keep an eye on the students who started college this year. I think it's just that they've been in a different world, and what is that going to mean? Or those that have stopped out, and how are they going to re-engage with the system?
Yeah, I'd say like I'm really interested in understanding students' thoughts and feelings about online education pre and post, like where we're going, where we are now, where we were before this point, where we're going in the future. We're sort of in this like limbo land right now. Um, but there's indication that from our community college enrollment survey that a plurality of students want to maintain some hybrid approach in the future, that they want to take some of their classes online and in person. And then there's like a fairly large chunk that want to do it in person, and then a fairly good chunk that want to do it online. So they're sort of like all across the board. My hypothesis there is that there's always been this sense that they want to do it that way, like that they want the ability to mix and match, but we've never really asked the question of like, okay, before this, what were your views on online education and how you wanted to mix and match your schedule, and what do you think it's going to look like in the future? I'm really curious about like the people who were anticipating like to be fully in person, whether or not they are going to want a continued mixture, like even if, like people who are traditionally on campus are like, hey, I would like to take one or two of my classes online, and what that could potentially mean for the future of higher education. We know a lot of people don't, from the survey Tamara and I conducted, don't love the quality of online education, but yet they're still interested in online education. Again, I think this goes back to flexibility. So trying to figure out like what was the lay of the land before by asking some reflective questions, and then like having people think about their future in the system, I think would be really interesting to understand where we're heading with digital learning.
I echo my colleagues, watching enrollments, re-enrollments like a hawk, paying attention to FAFSA completion and those things to see where there may be more or less participation. But I'm going to take this opportunity to hone in on where data systems fail and you can't necessarily get some of the basics covered. And so there's a lot of work to be done to improve public data quality and data sovereignty for Native communities to be able to answer some of these really detailed questions, which is why we partnered with the American Indian College Fund and working with other Native focused scholarship funds, because data we have to improve that in order to be able to have some concerted and deep conversations. So I'm going to plug again the need for data sovereignty, not just for Native folks, but again, multidimensionality of Latinx folks, as well as American, Asian American and Pacific Islander communities as well.
Well, a special thanks again, Sarah, Katherine, Tamara, Rachel, for joining us this afternoon and sharing insights and highlights from public opinion research that you all have conducted throughout the pandemic. As I said at the top of the conversation, we will be posting the recording of the Zoom on Third Way's website, and we'll be sure to push that out on our social media when it's up and ready, so stay on the lookout for that. Thanks again for joining us, and stay safe. Take care.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.